Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Lights, Camera, History, and this is part 2 of our Changeling review. I will put a link down below for the first part, which is mostly about the LAPD and their sketchy history. I thought it was important to establish some history before getting into the actual movie. I should have had this out sooner, but the LAPD Archives Division weren't much help. Later in this video, I will have a special guest, so please stick around for that later. But as always, if you like this video, hit the like button or hit that subscribe button. Any support is always appreciated. Okay, here we go. The movie is about the kidnapping and murder of Walter Collins, as well as the Wineville chicken coop murders. The story dedicates a significant amount of time to the investigation and what happened after the arrest. The events depicted in the movie are all too real and quite sad if you add it all together. In a moment of time when a mother needed help most from the authorities, she was shamed, lied to, and locked up, all because she wanted her son back. And here is the crazy part. She wanted her real son back. In March of 1928, Walter was allowed to go to the movies alone. This would be the last time Christine Collins would ever see her son. She didn't report him missing until 5 days later. Police were less than helpful, but it was a public case, so they were desperate to solve it with a happy ending. Despite some effort by the LAPD and lead investigator Captain J.J. Jones, the boy was nowhere to be found. The main theory was that the boy's biological father, in prison at the time, was in debt or something to the wrong people, and therefore his kidnapping was some sort of retribution. There was just no evidence to support this. So, fast forward several months later. A boy named Arthur Hutchins was eating alone in a diner, and somebody told him that he looked like a missing boy from LA. So something in this boy's mind went off like a light bulb. Hey, a free trip to LA. So he found a cop and said he was Walter. After being informed that her son was found, she was able to talk to him on the phone while he was in the custody of local Illinois cops. While in custody, the little con man was able to gather enough information, including some letters from Christine herself, which was enough about Walter to at least fool the cops. The boy's discovery was a victory for the embattled Los Angeles Police Department, which had come under fire for corruption and incompetency in recent years. Collins paid for her son to come home, and she was so traumatized at this point with little convincing from the cops, she thought it was her son too, wanting to believe it was him. She took him home, although she had her doubts. The cops were able to Jedi mind trick her into believing it was her son. It wasn't until the other boy got to the house that he seemed different enough to help Christine come back down to earth. He had an attitude. He didn't call her mother. Instead, he called her ma. He had strange habits and was easily agitated. And also, he looked different. He was shorter. Turns out he was different because, well, he wasn't Walter Collins. So Collins had her son's dental records compared and voila, it wasn't her son. She knew it wasn't him, but now she had proof. However, LAPD Captain J.J. Jones' response, instead of apologizing to Collins, reimbursing the money she spent on the boy's train tickets, and vowing to find her real son, Jones insisted she, and I quote, try the boy out. Oh wait, he's serious, as if there was some type of new toothpaste rather than a child. This was my favorite scene from the movie, and it's just amazing that this actually happened. Take the kid home on a trial basis. This dialogue actually comes from court records. And it's just absolutely crazy to think about something like this was said from a police officer. So what was this other boy thinking? Well, it was depression. He had no money. So it was an opportunity to get a free train ticket to Hollywood and maybe meet his favorite cowboy actor, Tom Mix. According to the Chicago Tribune, when later asked about duping the kidnapped child's mother, he said, "She was nice to me, and it's fun to be somebody you aren't." One of the major plot points that is all too real is the admission of Christine Collins to the local psych ward. Cops at this time in California had the legal authority to admit anybody they wanted to. I'm not sure if the real Jones did this because he thought he was right, or he just wanted to get rid of her. And if you weren't hating the LAPD enough, it wasn't until 3 days after Hutchins confessed that they let her out. Not 1, not 2, but 3 days.
The third day, okay?
Rather than back down and admit his mistake, Jones got angry. And according to the Los Angeles Times, Jones allegedly accused Collins of shirking her duty as a mother and trying to make fools of the police. Oh, you guys did that all on your own. Don't worry. He was quoted as saying, "You are the most cruel-hearted woman I've ever known. You are a fool," he apparently told her. Collins was finally released from the hospital 10 days after Hutchins confessed, and she immediately sued Jones and the LAPD. She won, but she never saw a penny of that judgment. The third act of the movie deals with the fallout of catching Gordon Stewart Northcott. As young boys' bodies were being dug up from the farm, Collins was let out due to the public scrutiny the cops received. Along the way, Collins was supported by several community members and politicians. The movie highlights two of these people as the Reverend Gustav Bricklieb, I don't know how to pronounce that, and which was played by John Malkovich, and S.S. Hahn, played by Jeff Pearson. However, in real life, she had other supporters as well, including her employer, which is only briefly touched on in the movie, and the local media. A man named Gordon Stewart Northcott and his mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, were being investigated for abducting, abusing, and killing young boys at their poultry ranch and would later become known as the Wineville Chicken Coop Murders. Most of the movie errors are with the police portrayals of the Wineville murders. For starters, I couldn't find anything about the real detective Lester Ybarra, who is portrayed as the lead detective in the movie. I could be wrong. LAPD rosters are incomplete at the time. It was possible he was a composite character. Regardless, it's good to see Doug Stamper again. For some reason, the movie admits any mention of the Northcott's mother being involved. She was convicted too. And I can mostly nitpick at some of the inaccuracies, but beyond that, I would give this a grade of A-. In history, Chief of Police James Davis was demoted following the Collins debacle. But, since it's the LAPD, the city reappointed him in the same position just 2 years later. Despite denials by her son that Walter Collins was among their victims, Sarah Louise Northcott confessed to killing the boy and was sentenced to life in prison. Her account was corroborated by her son's nephew, who claimed to have been coerced into being an accomplice in the murder. Understandably, Collins was not so convinced. While Gordon confessed to murdering Walter, he kept changing his story. When he couldn't recall Walter's eye color or clothing, or in fact ever meeting the boy, gave the mother hope her child was still alive. Gordon Stewart Northcott was ultimately convicted and executed for the killings of 3 other boys, an unidentified Mexican national, and brothers Louis and Nelson Winslow, aged 12 and 10 respectively. Unlike those cases, there's just no physical evidence of Walter Collins' death found at the Wineville Chicken Ranch. No belongings, no traces, no grave, no body. And later, Sarah Northcott later retracted her confession. This gave Christine Collins, according to the Los Angeles Times, she spent the rest of her life looking for her son. She died in 1964 at the age of 75. No sign of Walter Collins has ever been found. Okay, so when I was doing my research on the Walter Collins case, I came across the podcast Once Upon a True Crime. The podcast's host, Esther Ludlow, gave me some good ideas on where to start, so I had the idea to ask her to comment on the case. Here's what she had to say. What were your thoughts on the case after it was all said and done?
So, the Walter Collins case, yes, I did find this to be not only unbelievable, but kind of infuriating because this was indicative, I think, of just history. And of course, you are very well versed in history and certain crimes from history. One of the things I mean by that is we're talking about Christine Collins. Okay, so here's a woman who's raising her child on her own in the 1920s in Los Angeles, California. So she had a husband and they had a son named Walter, and he was born in 1918. But her husband was basically a con man who hid his past from her. He ended up getting arrested and put into Folsom State Prison for robbery. So Christine was raising Walter on her own. She was working, she worked as a telephone operator. And in 1928, he was 9 years old. By all accounts, she was doing well for herself with her job and being a very good mother to little Walter. But one day in March 10th of 1928, Walter goes missing. He had gone to a local movie theater, which was really just around the corner from where they lived, and never came home. So, of course, right away, she starts looking for Walter, doesn't find him, and goes to report it to the police that her son is missing. So she lived in the Lincoln Park area of Los Angeles. And near Lincoln Park, there was a lake. So they were saying, oh, maybe he ran away was the first thing the police said. Kids run away sometimes, and she just didn't believe it. So they thought, well, maybe something happened. He went to, go float a boat in the lake and fell in the lake. So, they searched the lake, they searched all around. When they couldn't find him, they basically said, well, yeah, he's a runaway. And they just kind of chalked it up to that. And Christine was telling them, my son is a certain type of child because he was raised by himself. He's an only child. He was raised, without a father. He's very responsible. Him and I are very close, and this, he wouldn't have done this. She's trying to get them to really do a thorough search investigation, for her son, and it's not happening. They're hearing all kinds of rumors from around town. They saw him in the company of a couple, and he put them, he was put in a car, all kinds of things that didn't pan out. This was very frustrating for Christine. It did get some attention outside of just locally in Los Angeles, and it was put in the newspapers of this little boy that went missing. The police chief at the time was James Davis. I think you talked a little bit about him in your video. And the police captain was J.J. Jones. They said that they did follow up on a lot of these leads, but nothing came of it because it was a case that people were talking about. And the fact that the LAPD didn't have any leads, didn't find this little boy, there was a lot of pressure put on them. There was a lot of negative publicity swirling around at the time, as you had mentioned in your first video, that the LAPD was rife with corruption from way back when. And at this time, there was reporting coming out about this. So they were facing a lot of scrutiny for several corruption scandals within the police department. So now they felt pressure to solve this case. And that's kind of how everything evolves. And the reason why we see what takes place next. So Christine, of course, as a mother whose son is missing for months now, weeks and then months, is really continuing to follow up and say, what are you doing? What leads do you have? Of course, all the things that you would do if your child was missing. 5 months later, in August, a boy was picked up in the state of Illinois, and he would not say who he was. He gave very little information. He was put with a foster family, and somehow, and maybe this is something you'll get into in your research, because I can't exactly remember how this came about, but the LAPD was contacted and sent photos. So, I think in the movie, and we'll talk about the movie in a minute, I'll give you my impressions of it really quickly at the end here. But in the movie, it shows that these police in Illinois who were trying to figure out who this kid was, somebody had seen pictures of little Walter Collins in the newspapers, had reached that area of the country and said, oh, this looks like Walter Collins. So then they questioned him. The kid at first said, no, it wasn't. But then he said, yes, he was Walter Collins. So I guess a photo was actually sent to Christine, and she said it wasn't him. But, of course, being hopeful that he was alive. And so here's a funny thing that I found in my research was that when she got the news that, supposedly her son might be alive in DeKalb, Illinois, the police said, oh, we're bringing your son home, this whole thing, right? But they made her pay for his ticket to be brought home, which I thought was kind of cold, but okay. LAPD doesn't have enough money for a train ticket. So anyway, he gets there, and as soon as he gets off the train, there's a lot in the movie that is true life of what happened, if you look at the news reports and things at that time. So there are some things that, of course, are changed, maybe embellished a little bit, but there's a lot to it that was historically accurate. As soon as he came off the train, he said, that's not her son. But everybody was there. So the LAPD made this a huge press event with reporters. They called reporters to be there for the big reunion of Walter Collins being found, supposedly the LAPD, and brought home to his mother. And then there was going to be this big emotional reunion, and it was going to be in all the papers. And of course, it was going to make the police look like heroes, right? Which is what they wanted, was this positive press. But it didn't happen because Christine said, that's not my kid. Captain J.J. Jones was really pretty ticked off about this. And he started telling her, "Yes, it is Walter. You haven't seen him for 5 months, and you've been under trauma," and all of these things he's telling her why she doesn't recognize her own child, right? And she's like, Are you insane? Like, of course I would know my son. Are you nuts? That's not him." But because the LAPD didn't want to be humiliated by their big mistake that this was not Walter in front of all this press, he basically told her, "Look, you need to just take this kid, take him home, see if your memory comes back, and your whatever." So she felt badly because she didn't know who this kid was. And she thought, oh my gosh, this kid is, clearly been sent across the country, and the police aren't going to do it. They're just going to dump him, I guess. Well, let me just take him home and at least make sure he's safe. But meanwhile, she knew it wasn't her son. And
What do you think happened to Walter?
there was some debate of whether that's actually what happened to Walter. And I wonder whether the debate wasn't because, again, the LAPD and anyone connected with this case were trying to basically say, no, that didn't happen. Because, of course, it makes them look bad because they didn't do the thorough investigation they should have done from the very beginning. Because by all accounts of the people who said they knew what happened to Walter, that he was kept for a time at this ranch before he was killed and then buried out in the desert. So some remains were found. There was also some items found that connected what the nephew told the police about these boys. Walter went missing in March of 1928, and then there was two brothers, Lewis and Nelson Winslow, who went missing in May from Pomona, California, just about 30 miles from where Walter disappeared. There was evidence found at Northcott's place connected to the Winslow boys. So they believed that for sure that those boys were victims of Northcott. There wasn't anything found that was connected to Walter, though. So that was where a little bit of the debate came in, but there was corroboration from other people connected to the case about Walter. So I tend to believe that he was one of the victims of Northcott, who was, of course, one of our earlier California serial killers. I believe there's enough there to make people very much suspect that he was one of the victims. Nothing definitive, no physical evidence that they found. Even the remains that they found were very minimal, bone fragments. There was some detail given that the boys that were first buried on the ranch and then later taken out to the desert and bodies burned. So that's why a lot more remains were not found. So yeah, I believe that. But Christine Collins, she never stopped looking for her son. She even went and traveled to the prison where Northcott was to talk to him to see if he would tell her, once and for all what happened to her son. That was a whole nother story, but I won't get into that. But she never did know for sure exactly what happened to him. There was one boy, at least, who had also disappeared, who they believed had been a victim of Northcott, but sometime later where he actually returned home. So that was another thing that kind of kept her hope going, that maybe he was also somebody who they mistakenly thought was Northcott's. But, I think that was a way for her to live with the grief that she was dealing with, to, have her son missing, by all accounts, a victim of a serial killer. So that is what I think happened to him, I believe. And one of the things we do know about Gordon Northcott, which I didn't say, is that he was a pathological liar. He lied about so many things. But there was other corroboration from other witnesses who had kind of the same story about what happened to Walter with the details. So to me, it seemed like those different accounts, because they did match, would lend me to believe that that is exactly what happened. But for, some people, it remains a mystery. It's one of those kind of cases that we will never know for sure, but we can make a pretty good educated guess.
All right. Thanks, Esther. And if anybody's interested, you can check her out on podcasts on Spotify and Apple, and her website, onceuponatruecrime.com. It's also, she's done a lot of great episodes, including the Stacy Peterson case and even the Wendy's chili finger scam. So check that out. Thank you, Esther, for lending us your time. We hope you enjoyed this. Please comment down below or find us on the Tweeting Bird place where people are always getting banned off of.